Can you believe it? Scientists have created a synthetic cell for the first time ever. It's called Spud cell, and one day it might help us repair the body, fight aging, and even live longer. But to see why this tiny droplet matters so much, we first need to understand what makes a cell, well, a cell. Look at trees, fish, worms. All living organisms are made of tiny building blocks called cells. And most cells come with the same basic setup. They're surrounded by a plasma membrane. It acts like the walls of a house, creating a boundary between what is inside the cell and what is outside. Then, cells have cytoplasm. It's basically the liquid inside the cell, filled with tiny structures that keep everything running. So, a plasma membrane and cytoplasm. Those are the two things all cells have in common. From there, cells can split into many different types, and some of them can do pretty amazing things, like eating and reproducing. To do that, they use different parts. For example, the nucleus stores DNA and helps control cell division, and the lysosome works kind of like the cell's tummy. It uses digestive enzymes to break down food, waste, and other material the cell doesn't need. Cells don't live for the same amount of time. Some types of white blood cells, for example, may only live for a few hours. Skin cells can last for a few weeks, and many brain cells can stay with us for decades. But sooner or later, every single cell reaches the end of its life, and most of them get replaced. Now, the big question is, if our body can replace old cells with new ones, why do we age? Well, it turns out that this whole replacement system becomes less reliable over time. As we get older, the processes that help cells renew themselves don't work as well as they used to. And one major reason is DNA damage. DNA carries the instructions that tell cells what to do. But over time, those instructions can get damaged. Eventually, some cells can no longer divide properly, and that's a big part of why we age. Now, getting old is inevitable, sure, but creating an artificial cell could help us avoid some of the worst parts of aging. For example, these cells could one day help rejuvenate existing tissues or repair some age-related DNA damage. In the long run, they might even help prevent health problems like diabetes. That's why creating lab-made cells has been such a big scientific goal. But as you now know, cells are complicated. Building an artificial one from scratch is definitely not easy, especially because all these cell functions have to work together. And that's where things get tricky. One function might need a certain amount of magnesium, while another might need a specific level of acidity, for example. So instead of trying to build a full living cell right away, many scientists have focused on recreating one function at a time, like feeding or dividing. But then came Spud cell. Biologist Kate Adamala and her team at the University of Minnesota say they have created the first artificial cell ever, one that can grow and eat. Okay, you may remember hearing that scientists had already created an artificial cell before. And it's true. Back in 2010, researchers built DNA in a lab and placed it inside a different bacterial cell. The synthetic DNA then booted up, took control of the cell, and allowed it to reproduce. At the time, this was considered the world's first artificial cell. But that's not exactly the same as creating one from scratch, right? I mean, they still needed that bacterial cell to make it work. Things are a little different this time, because scientists say Spud cell was built from scratch. But it still relies on something called the Pure system. This is basically a lab-made kit made of biomolecules, including proteins and ribosomes. These are the parts needed to read DNA, turn it into RNA, and then use that RNA to make proteins. The researchers gave Spud cell a very small genome, basically a tiny set of genetic instructions. Inside that genome, they added genes that tell Spud Cell how to make special molecular tags on its surface. These tags work like tiny attachment points. That matters because smaller bubbles, called feeder vesicles, can connect to them. These vesicles carry enzymes and other molecules that Spud Cell needs to keep going. So, in a way, they act like tiny meals. They help Spud Cell grow and copy its genome. Then came the next step, getting Spud Cell to divide. For that, the researchers added another surface tag called flag. This tag can bind to a large molecule called streptavidin. When enough streptavidin is added, it creates a repelling force between molecules on the droplet surface. And once that force becomes strong enough, it can push the droplet apart and split it in two. Spud Cell is not a plant or an animal. It's more like a very simple bacterium. It is made of about 150 to 200 molecules, which is much simpler than a natural cell. To give you an idea, a real biological cell can contain millions or even billions of molecules. If you look at Spud Cell under a microscope, it looks like a tiny microscopic water droplet, but it's surrounded by a fatty membrane and filled with chemicals along with small pieces of DNA that carry 36 genes. So even though it is simple, this tiny droplet can fuse with other droplets, copy its genome, and divide. But here's the thing, Spud Cell is still far from being a truly living cell. One reason is that its division process is not efficient at all. To get Spud cells to divide more than once, the researchers had to help them along. They mechanically split the droplets by pushing them through a membrane with tiny holes. And after doing this several times, they found another problem. When Spud cells divide, their copied genomes don't always separate evenly. After 5 rounds of division, only about 30% of the Spud cells still had the full genome. And that's a big issue. Another problem is the ribosome, the complex structure that makes proteins inside the cell. In Spud Cell, ribosomes break down over time, but the system has no way to make new ribosomes or remove the old damaged ones. So Spud Cell still doesn't have one of life's key abilities. I mean, the ability to keep itself going and evolve on its own. So the good news is that scientists know exactly what Spud Cell is made of. That makes it easier to tweak, improve, and maybe one day turn into something much more advanced. Actually, the first follow-up experiment has already happened. The researchers added a genetic mutation to some Spud cells that allowed them to grab more feeder vesicles, basically more food, and grow faster. And it worked. After 5 rounds of growth and division, about 60% of the genomes carried the mutation. But this still wasn't evolution happening on its own, not in the Darwinian sense. The researchers added the mutation themselves, and they still had to mechanically divide the cells. So no, we still can't really call Spud Cell an artificial life form. Now, you may be asking, then why does any of this matter? Well, like I said earlier, synthetic cells could one day help us avoid some of the worst parts of aging. But this kind of research could also help in many other ways. Lab-made cells might eventually be designed to capture carbon, meaning they could pull carbon dioxide out of the air or from industrial emissions. These synthetic cells might also one day be used to make useful materials, like fuels, plastics, or chemicals found in everyday products. In the future, they could even help us produce food. Now, we're still far away from seeing those results in real life. But still, this is an important first step. It's the closest scientists have ever come to building something that acts like a real cell. And in the long run, it could open the door to things we can barely imagine today.